out, people both who are here in person and the people on Zoom. A lot of times when we talk about celebrating Black History Month, we have a tendency to gravitate to the very few well-known, nationally and internationally known Black figures. And although they deserve to be celebrated, sometimes we don't have to go quite as far to celebrate Black history. For me, I go to my family. In 1966, Annette Fuller Hightower became the first African-American nurse anesthesia resident to graduate from a West Virginia nurse anesthesia program. She traveled 70 miles each day throughout her residency and worked as a registered nurse while being a single parent. Annette Fuller Hightower, or Queen as we called her in my family, is my first cousin. She became the first African-American to work as a CRNA in the state of West Virginia. Her younger son, Frederick Hightower, not only is he pastor of a church in West Virginia, but he's also a very talented sculptor. He had the opportunity to do a sculpture of Katherine Johnson, who you may know from Hidden Figures. Now, for those of you who are now concerned that I'm going to burst into song like Mirabelle and Encanto about my amazing family, I am not going to do that. Not that I don't think my family is amazing, but I think that each of you and your families have people who are amazing as well. What I am going to do is I'm going to take you through a little bit of my journey into genealogy. And in doing so, I hope I'll give you some tools and some tips to either get started in your journey in genealogy or to continue, and you can uncover some of the history in your family. My journey in genealogy actually started in 1993. At the time, I was working as a management consultant for Price Waterhouse, and I was working on a project that took me to Salt Lake City for a few days. When I discovered that I was just a few blocks from the family history library, I got pretty excited because I've always wanted to know more about my family history. You see, my mother was the 15th of 16 children born in Coffee County, Georgia. She lost her mother when she was 6 years old, and she lost her father when she was 16. I remember one Mother's Day, we were at church, and my church had the tradition that you wore the carnations for Mother's Day. Some of you probably went through that too. And I remember as a very young child, my mother explaining to me that my carnation was going to be red because my mother was still living, and that her carnation was going to be white because her mother passed away. And I remember asking my mother, well, what did your mom die from? And my mother, with a very straight face to a very young child, said, exhaustion. She had 16 kids. Now, I think the reality of it is that my mom never really knew what her mother died from. Through genealogy, within the past 6 months, I came across her death certificate, so I now know what my grandmother died from. My father was born in Caroline County, Maryland, and he was the 7th of 8 children. He lost his father when he was 12 years old and his mother when he was 22. So I grew up without grandparents. Although both of my parents came from very large families and they were very close with their siblings, I always felt that there was something missing in my family. There was a piece of my family and a piece of my history that was missing. So I always wanted to know a little bit more about my family. So since I was so close to the family history library, after I finished my work and everything for the job, I went down to the family history library. Now, I'll be honest, I was very skeptical. I didn't think that they'd be able to actually tell me anything about my family. But I went anyway. I went through their little training session on genealogy, and they tell you a lot of things to start with. And one of the first things is they tell you to start with as close as you can get to your current generation. So start with your parents, your grandparents, that kind of thing. And fortunately, I did know my grandparents' names and where they lived. And we started in the 1920 census. This was 1993, so the latest census that had been released was the 1920 census. They hold census records for 70 years. So the 1920 census was available. Neither of my parents had been born at that time, but like I said, fortunately, I knew their parents' names and actually their grandparents and that kind of thing. But I was able to figure out where they were and try to track this through the census. Now, to my surprise, I actually did find, these are my parents, Thomas Dawson, Isaiah Dawson, and Juna Bernice Reed Dawson. This was the year that they got married in 1952. And the other picture over here is my dad holding a picture of himself when he enlisted in the Merchant Marines in 1945. And again, when he got drafted into the Army in 1955. This picture actually hangs in Mission Barbecue in Philadelphia. So if you ever get to the Mission Barbecue in Philadelphia, there's a booth in the corner that has his picture over it. So I started with what I knew about my family. Of course, like I said, in 1920, my parents had not been born yet, but I did have their parents' names. To my surprise, I found my grandparents in the 1920 census. Now, at the time, 1993, all of the census records were on microfilm and microfiche. So you actually had to be in the library, you had to dig through all the information. What's pictured here is the 1920 census index that shows my grandparents. Now, these are my grandparents, John Herman Dawson and Mary Elsie Brooks Dawson. And if you look at the index here, you'll see John Herman Dawson, he's listed as being mulatto. They've got his age, he's in Caroline County, Maryland. They have his wife here. In the census records, they list, at least for 1920, they list the family members or the people who lived in the house and then the relationship to the person, to the head of the household. So we have Mary Dawson listed as wife. We have actually Linwood listed as son. Now, Linwood was not actually their son. He was a child who, for some reason, his parents weren't able to raise him, so my grandparents took him in. So biologically, he was not their son, but he's listed in the census as being their son. Here we have my dad's oldest sister, May Frances Dawson. I find it funny, it shows here that she's 2.5 years old. And for me, it's really funny to see my oldest aunt as a child in the census. This last line here, it says Julia Brown, and it has M there, that's for mother. Now, it actually should be Julia Brooks, I believe. At that time, she may have been going by Brown, but her name was Julia Brooks, and she was actually the mother of Mary Elsie Brooks. If we look at the actual census record, that's what it looks like. There's a lot of information that's captured on the census. I know you can't read it right now, but this section here is where my family is. And it has a lot of information going across. A close-up of that shows you pretty much the same things that was on the index. You've got John Herman Dawson, head of the household. Here we have whether he owned or rented his property, and it has O for owned. The next column is whether it was owned free and clear or mortgaged, and he owned it free and clear. Then you have the gender, the race. They have them listed as mulatto. I'm not exactly sure why, but we can explore that a little bit later. So this is part of the information that was captured in the census. Now, the 1920 census, they actually had a lot of other information. They start off, if we go back here on the side, this is information about where the house actually was. So in the census records, you have the street, the house number, all the identifying things about where the person lived. Then you have the name, the relationship to the head of the household, whether they owned or rented their property, whether it was owned freely or mortgaged. You have their gender and you have their race. In 1920, they listed race as W for white, B for black, MU for mulatto, CH for Chinese, JP for Japanese, IN for American Indian, and OT for others. Other information that they captured: their age, their last birthday, whether they were single, married, widowed, or divorced. They had information about immigration, whether they were naturalized, if they had attended school in the last year, whether they could read or write. The next section is really important information if you're going to do genealogy. They have the person's birthplace and their mother tongue. They also have the birthplace of their father and mother tongue, birthplace of their mother. So you can see how this will help you if you're trying to track back a little bit further through genealogy. They also have their profession and other information that might be interesting to see about your families. So having found my family in the 1920 census, I decided to go back to the 1910 census. So here we see again, John Herman Dawson in the 1910 census. He's listed as the head of the household. We have Mary E, his wife. We now have Mary J listed as mother. Mary J is actually John's mother. And this is Mary Jane Benton Dawson, my great-grandmother. For a lot of us, we think slavery was so long ago. Well, for me, I don't really think of it as being that long ago because Mary Jane Benton Dawson, my great-grandmother, was born a slave. I found out through some other genealogy work, I found deposition paperwork through the National Archives. Her husband was Preston, who was a Civil War soldier. During the Civil War, he was injured in the war. He also got malaria. He dislocated his knee, which was never set properly, so he limped for the rest of his life. He also got malaria. He ended up with all kinds of things. So he filed for pension, which he was briefly granted, and then they took it back, and there was a real battle for pension, both for him, and then after he passed away, she tried to get pension as well. So there was a lot of documentation for the pension or depositions and pension stuff. So I found out in the depositions that Mary Jane Benton, not only was she born a slave, but it also listed who her owners were. So she was previously owned by Charles and Samuel Walls. And Preston bought the farm that John owns at this point, from Charles and Samuel Walls. Now, when my dad found out this information, he was really excited. He's like, Walls, did you say that her previous owners were the Walls family? I said, yes. He grew up surrounded by people who were named Walls. So that kind of gave him a little bit of information why all the families around him were named Walls. Moving on, we go to the 1900 census. In the 1900 census, this is where we see my great-grandfather, Preston. Now, there's a little bit of controversy over what his name really is, because in some of the records it says Preston, and some of it says Presley, some of it just says Press. He went by all of those, so I don't know what his actual first name was, but he was actually born Dorsey. Now, I knew from talking to my dad, he said, well, the family name used to be Dorsey. It was changed to Dawson, but we don't know why. Going through genealogy, I discovered why the name changed, but we'll get to that. So here we see Preston Dorsey in the 1900 census in Queen Anne County. Actually, I think that's a mistake. It should be Caroline County. Caroline County was at one point part of Queen Anne County, but I think they had separated before 1900. So we see Preston Dorsey. We see his wife here listed as Jane on this one. Now, it's really important to know names and middle names and nicknames and all that kind of stuff, because sometimes you don't get the exact name. My great-grandmother's name was Mary Jane Benton. Here she's listed as Jane. My grandfather on the other census records, if you'll remember, his name was John Herman. Here he's listed just as Herman, and he's listed as son. And they also have Wesley here listed as a servant. Not exactly sure who Wesley was. But going back to the 1880 census, again, we see Preston Dorsey, his wife, Mary J. My grandfather's older siblings, George, William, and Mary. My grandfather was not born yet at this point. And so we can track it back to the 1880 census. Going back even further to the 1870 census. Here's a little bit different. Here we see he's listed as Press Dorsey, and it says his wife is named Sophia. Not a mistake. Through the deposition paperwork, I also found out that his first wife was named Sophia Gross. So my grandmother was actually his second wife. So we can verify this really is the same family. He's married to Sophia in 1870. Somewhere between 1870 and 1880 is when he bought the farm from the Walls family, and that's the farm that my father grew up on. It was a 27.5-acre farm that my dad grew up on. I actually went to that farm a few years ago with my dad, and it's still a 27.5-acre farm, and it's still on a dirt road. It's preserved in that same manner, 27.5-acre farm, and it's now a horse farm. So.
Did Sophia die? Do we know?
I don't know. That information I don't know. I really didn't track Sophia. I just noted that his first wife was named Sophia Gross, and they actually had a son named Tennessee. I haven't been able to really track him much either, but it's interesting information to find them in the 1870 census. Now, the 1870 census is one that's a really significant census for most African Americans, because that's the first census record that you would pick up people who were formerly slaves. If you were a slave, you were listed in the slave schedules, and they really didn't list a whole lot of information on there. And we'll see a slave schedule a little bit later, but they just list the number of slaves. They'll list their ages and gender, and that's pretty much it. But I'll show you one of those later. Now, I knew that my great-grandfather was a Civil War soldier. My dad actually had this medal, and when I started doing genealogy, he showed it to me, and he said, find out what all of this means. I was going to bring the medal today, but I was afraid with my record of misplacing things that I didn't want to misplace that. But I actually do have that medal. Now, what it really says here, it's P. Dorsey. He was in Company H of the 43rd Volunteer Infantry of the U.S. Colored Troops. It has PA here because he enlisted in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And here it says Maryland because he was from Maryland. So this is information I was able to find out through some of the U.S. Colored Troop records. In fact, I was able to track down his enlistment papers. Now, this was from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I can tell you I spent many, many, many weekends, almost entire weekends, in the National Archives looking through microfilm and microfiche. This is not microfilm or microfiche. This is actually the actual paperwork that he enlisted. So I had to request that paperwork. It took a couple of weeks for them to find it and dig it out and that kind of thing. But I was able to actually touch the same paperwork that my great-grandfather signed for his enlistment. But it was really important to know that he was in the 43rd Regiment, because here we have the enlistment in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He's listed as Presley Dawson. Now that's the reason for the name change. When he filed for the pension, they said, well, you were enlisted under the name of Presley Dawson. Since he could not read or write, as evidenced by his mark here, he didn't know what they wrote down. He told them what his name was. They wrote down what they thought they heard, I guess. And instead of hearing Dorsey, they heard Dawson. They wrote it down as Presley Dawson. And if you'll notice, between 1880 and 1900, the family name changes from Dorsey to Dawson. That's about the same time that they started, trying to get the pension. So we have that he enlisted in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. One of the things that was in the deposition work, my great-grandmother apparently in one of the depositions said, here's a picture of Presley. We don't know what happened to that picture. It was probably so faded that it didn't make it through time and that kind of thing. But she says, here's a picture of Presley. He's so light that you can't tell whether he's black or white. If we look at his enlistment paperwork, it's listed here, Presley Dawson, that he was 24 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall. His complexion was yellow, his eyes hazel, his hair dark, and he's from Howard County, Maryland. Presley Dorsey very likely was mulatto. Now, one of the historians, when we went to the Civil War Memorial for the U.S. Colored Troops, we showed the medal to a historian there, and we only talked to him briefly. I gave him my card, and I was hoping to hear from him. Never did. But he saw the medal and he said, Dorsey, I know this family, Howard County, Maryland. And my dad said, wow, what do you know about them? Tell me what you know. And this gentleman said that there was a big Dorsey plantation, that there was a relationship between one of the owner's sons and a slave, and that there were several children, and that they freed all of the children in the family. Don't know for sure that Presley was one of those, but certainly with the complexion of being listed as yellow and his eyes as hazel, there's a good chance that he was mulatto. This is actually the U.S. Colored Troops Memorial in Washington, D.C. I was there for the dedication of it. At the time, it was not finished, but you can see here on the outside of it, you have representation of the soldiers and sailors that went off to war. And then on the backside, you have the families, representation of the families that they left behind. When they finished the memorial, they actually had the names of all the soldiers engraved around the memorial. So my great-grandfather, Presley Dawson, is listed there along with one of my great-grandfathers from my mother's side, Frederick Shaw. I don't have as much information on Frederick Shaw, but we do see here Frederick Shaw was in the 6th U.S. Colored Troops. He was from Bladen, North Carolina, and he enlisted in Wilmington, North Carolina. His description, he's listed as being 5'10" with hazel eyes, black hair, and he was a dark complexion. from the family stories, they say that Frederick Shaw was actually half Native American and half African. But I don't have a lot more information on him. More recently, I've done some of the DNA testing through both Ancestry.com and 23andMe, which actually has linked me to some other distant relatives, one of whom on the Dorsey side, he's a white Dorsey or related to the white Dorseys. And he can actually trace his family back to Edward Dorsey. Here we see a Maryland Historical Society plaque to Edward, Joshua, and John Dorsey, sons of Edward Dorsey, who settled in Maryland in 1650. So my bloodline somehow goes back to Edward Dorsey, who is who's the patriarch of one of the most prominent families in Maryland. Now on my mom's side, I also found my mom's family in the 1920 census. So here we have my grandfather, John Reed, his wife, Lily, my mom's older siblings, Annie, Johnny. My mom, of course, was not born at this point. I also looked at the 1930 census, since the 1930 and now the 1940 census have now been released. And we can see again, my grandfather, John Reed. Note here that Reed is spelled R-E-A-D instead of R-E-E-D. Lily is spelled here with a Y and here with an I-E. So sometimes, depending on who was taking down the information, some of the spellings were different. One of the things that the census does, they have a Soundex file that helps you with spellings. So they have a listing of things that sound about the same. So you'll pick up the R-E-E-D, the R-E-A-D, you'll pick up R-E-I-D, and actually my family appears as all of those in different census records. So here we have the R-E-E-D with John and Lily and Annie, and here we have R-E-A-D with John and Lily. We've got Effie, who's consistent on both of them. In the 1930 census, this is pretty interesting to me. By then, my mother was born. And we'll see her older siblings. Here we have one of my favorite aunts, my Aunt Jewel. Her name was actually Tommy Jewel. On this census record, it's listed as Jewel. And this is actually my mother. My mother's name was actually Juna Bernice. On the 1930 census, she's listed as Bernice. But if you look at the 1940 census, now my Aunt Jewel is listed as Tom J. And my mother is listed as Juna. So you do have to know names, middle names, nicknames, all kinds of things to make sure that you're tracking the right people in your family. Another interesting thing in this census record, like I said, it told birthplace. Here, if you notice, in the 1940 census, we have John Reed here listed as the head of the households. By then, his wife had died, so he's listed as a widow. And it says that he was born in South Carolina. Important information when you're trying to track back. Now I know if I look for him before 1920, which would have been with his parents, that I need to look in South Carolina instead of in Georgia. So I did that too. Here we have John Reed, and again, it's R-E-I-D here. John Reed, he was a 6-year-old child at that point. His parents, James and Judy. Now I verified with some of my older aunts and uncles that my grandfather was from Cheraw, South Carolina. So I know this is the right record, has the right John. And especially when you're talking about names like John or Mary, or they're so common, and a last name with Reed, there are so many John Reeds who were 6 years old that year that I had to verify through looking at some of the siblings here and where he was to make sure it was the right record. So we do have them in the 1880 census. Another source of information, you can look at things like marriage certificates. That's a great source of information. This is a marriage certificate actually for one of my mom's older sisters, Opal Reed. In 1945, she married Richard Bazemore. Now here's a picture. This is my mom here. This is my aunt, Tommy Jewel. This is Opal. This is my aunt Estelle, my aunt Jessie, and my aunt Annie. The information that they have here, they not only have their names, they have their parents' names. Here's her father's John and Lily Shaw. Was her mother, have the mother's maiden name? So if you don't know mother's maiden names, marriage certificates give you that kind of information. I did know her name was Shaw. We can verify that it was Shaw through this record. The other piece of information I thought was really interesting. When we talk about World War II and how many women went to work in manufacturing in World War II, and we see people like Rosie the Riveter and that kind of thing. Well, my family has Opal the Welder. You can also look at death certificates. Here we have a death certificate for my grandmother, Lillian Reed. She was born in Whiteville, North Carolina. She was, her father was Fred Shaw. Here it says that her mother was Annie Blunt. That's not exactly true, but there's a reason for that too. And here we have her cause of death. She had malarial fever. I wish that I could have told my mother when she was living that her mother died of malaria. But unfortunately, my mother died in 1990 before I started doing all the research. So we do have an answer to that question, at least, what my grandmother died from. But you have all kinds of interesting information here. If you don't have maiden names, you'll find those on death certificates as well. Another source of information, if you have things like family Bibles. A lot of times families have Bibles, you have information written down in Bibles and that kind of thing. Well, my Aunt Jewel came to me and she says, hey, we have an old family Bible, and we have these names listed, we have dates listed, but I don't know how these people are related to us. One of the names that was listed was the name of David Blunt. She didn't know how David Blunt was related. Here we have Annie listed as Annie Blunt, and I'll tell you that's really wasn't her maiden name. But, oh, what happened there? Thank you. Going back to the 1900 census, we see Fred Shaw, we see his wife Annie, we see my grandmother Lillian. At this point, she was 14 years old. She's listed in the 1900 census. Going back a little bit further, the name David Blunt, I started looking for David Blunt, found David Blunt. He was married to Mariah at that point, who was my great-grandmother, Mariah. I knew that her name was Mariah. We didn't know what her maiden name was. And if you see here, it lists John Wooten, James Wooten, Will Wooten, Aram, and they are all listed as stepsons. And then we have Andrew Blunt, who was actually the child of Mariah and David. So I went back to the 1870 census and I was able to find Mariah Wooten with her husband Lot Wooten. And this is where we see my great-grandmother here, Anne, or Annie. So her maiden name actually was Wooten, but because her mother married a Blunt, it was recorded that her maiden name was Annie Blunt, where it should have been Annie Wooten. Now, another significant thing, like I said, in the 1870 census, that's the first one that really picked up a lot of the Black families for people who were enslaved. Took the time to look up the slave schedules. Now, I told you that my great-grandmother, Mary Jane Benton, was previously owned by Charles and Samuel Walls. Here's Samuel Walls in the 1860 slave records, and it shows here that he has 3 slaves. One was a Black male who was 22. You have a female who was 18 and a female who was 19. Very likely that one of these, either the 18-year-old or 19-year-old, was my great-grandmother, Mary Jane Benton. From my record, she was born in 1941, but I think she was born later in the year, so she may actually be this 18-year-old slave listed here. But the slave records, they had the owner's name, and then they just listed how many, what age, gender, and that information. So if your family is fortunate enough to be able to get back to knowing, who the owners were and that kind of thing, you're not going to see any names for any of the slaves here. And it's really kind of a hurtful thing to see your family reduced to listed as being property. Now, fortunately, for some parts of my family, they were free people of color. So I'm able to track, for example, this is again on my dad's side. Julia Woodland. Now, Julia Woodland is the grandmother of Julia Brooks. So this would be my great, great, great grandmother. And she's listed in the 1850 census in Maryland as a free person of color, head of household. We have Susan and Isaiah and all the other residents at that point. Here we have an old family picture. I am not exactly sure. It was labeled as Woodland, but I'm not sure if this is Julia Woodland or Susan Woodland. But my dad had these old pictures, and being able to tie some of them to some of the census records was really amazing. We also see my great-grandfather, Thomas Murray, listed here, Thomas, as the grandson. And a lot of the census stuff, they tell you don't skip generations. They want you to go step by step, generation by generation, so that you don't attach people to the wrong families. Unfortunately, in this case, I really don't know who Thomas's parents are, but I do know his grandmother was Rhoda Murray. Being able to track back with Rhoda Murray, I can see her in the 1960 census, Wilson Murray and Rhoda Murray. She's a free person of color, or they're all free people of color at that point. I can actually go back to the 1840 census, and if you look here, we see Rhoda Murray. She's listed as the head of the household, and she's the only person who's in that household at that point. In the 1840 census, you see free white persons, and then you see free colored persons. And her little mark is over here. She was the only person in her household in 1840. I don't know the circumstances behind her being free, but I do know she was a free person of color in 1840. So how do you get started with genealogy? You want to start with what you know. You want to start with your parents. Well, actually, you start here with who you are, where you were born, all that information. Then you go to your parents, and you go step by step back to find that information. Some of the things that you're going to look at, some common records, you're going to look at things like birth certificates, death certificates, Social Security index information, marriage records, baptism records, wills and probates. If you can find wills and probates, gives you lots of information on that. Land deeds. If your family immigrated from somewhere else, you can have passenger lists. Draft cards is a really good way of getting information. Naturalization records, city records, family Bibles, obituaries. Usually in obituaries, you have parents' names. You can look at cemetery records. Looking at draft cards, I actually was able to find my father's draft card. So here we have Thomas Isaiah Dawson. At that point, he lived on Diamond Street in Philadelphia. And here we have a name of a person who will always know your address. I thought that was interesting how they listed that. But we have Mary Dawson, who was his mother. And he was a merchant marine, and he was drafted actually into the Army. But I also found my grandfather's draft card. So we have John Herman Dawson from World War I. And it lists also his nearest relative as Mary Elsie Dawson, his wife. I find it interesting that my grandmother is listed on both of those registration cards. But again, that gives you a little bit of information about where they were, people who would know where they are, that kind of thing, so that it helps you put families together. Some other information, if you're looking at doing genealogy. I tried to get someone from the Hamilton County Library to come and talk about all the services that they have and the resources they have. Unfortunately, they were not available, but on their website, they do have a genealogy section. Here they have Ancestry.com. Now, Ancestry.com is a great website, gives you the little leaves and that kind of stuff so that you can get ideas about records that might match your family. Be careful with those because they don't all match your family. Make sure you investigate that very carefully to make sure that it really is someone that matches your family. You can decline those links if they don't match your family. Unfortunately, Ancestry.com costs money, and a lot of people are not ready to invest in Ancestry.com. But the public library, if you go down to the downtown branch of the public library, they actually have access to Ancestry.com for free, but you have to use it in the library. They also have Chattanooga obituaries if your family is from this area. They have Genealogy Connect that you can use there. Heritage Quest is another one like Ancestry.com that you have to pay for, but the library has free access to it. They have Tennessee maps. They have actually remote access for the Tennessee maps, so you can see if your family's from this area, you can link to the maps and see what areas, what it looked like in that time. They have the Tennessee Virtual Archives. They have Tennessee landmark documents, volunteer voices, death records. They have a lot of information that's available right at the library. Some other popular sources. You can look at some websites. Actually, FamilySearch.org is a free site. It's run by the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. And you can do a lot of the things that you do on Ancestry.com on Family Search. You can build your family tree. It links you to census records. It links you to a lot of information, and you don't have to pay for it. It also does give you some hints and clues. Hey, this might be somebody that's related to your family, or this might be a document for someone in your family. So you can go into that. I haven't explored that quite as much as some of the other sites, but it's a free site. So I will be looking at that and making sure that it has a lot of the information. I was on there the other night and found some census information and that kind of stuff. The great thing, unlike when I started in 1993 and having to go through the microfilm and microfiche, a lot of those records are online now. So you can see everything. You don't have to spend your whole weekend digging through microfilm and microfiche. You can just type something into the internet and boom, your records show up. Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, US Gen Web. That's also a free site that has a lot of genealogical information on there. Some of the other sources, you can actually just Google and see what local genealogy societies there are. Sometimes if you can get hooked into the local sites, they can help you. There are people who do this just for fun. I mean, they spend all their time looking up records and hooking into these kind of things. And they can help you to identify your family. They can give you some sources, some information to lead you to the right sources and that kind of thing. You can look at some of the local historical societies, genealogy libraries. Census records are a good place to start. But sometimes you're going to get lost in the census records and not be able to get further back, especially if you don't know maiden names. Like I said, some of the other information, the marriage records, death certificates, that kind of thing, can help you with some of the maiden names, but sometimes you're going to just get lost. Looking at newspaper records is also a good thing if your family appeared in the newspaper for some reason. Maybe wedding announcements, it may be any kind of thing that appeared in the news. You may be able to track some of your family by that. I know some people who have tracked some of their family by people being arrested for like stealing horses and that kind of stuff. Not really what you want to think about with your family, but sometimes they do have those kind of records that appear in the newspapers and you can say, oh yeah, that's one of my family members. Maybe not the ones we talk about, like in Encanto, we don't talk about Bruno, but you can look at some of the city records, cemetery records, state archives, really good sources of information. Some of the other things that the Hamilton County Library sent over, they sent over some other references that you can look at, particularly if you're looking at African-American families. They have a book in the library, African-American and American Indian Patriots of the Revolutionary War, African-American Genealogy Source Book. They've got some things, here's a plantation stories. Let's see, Family Pride, a complete guide to tracing African-American genealogy. You've got Bergman's The Negro and the Continental Congress. Slaves Without Masters, it traces some of the free Negroes in the antebellum South. Black Indians, Black Soldiers and Sailors. I'll probably take a look at this one just to see what I can find about that one. Here we've got Black men's slavery by another name, the re-enslavement of Black Africans from the Civil War to World War II. What I find really interesting is finding out what happened, because a lot of times in history, in some of the history classes, they'll teach you about slavery, and then you really don't see Black people until the 1960s. So here's an interesting thing when we talk about Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, to see what life was like for Black families at that time. We have here slave testimony, which is another thing that I wanted to bring up. We have, in the 1930s, they actually did recordings of former slaves. And this is actually one of those, it has CDs and it has a book. And they actually they interviewed some of the slaves about their lives. One of the things that I've heard more times through this is that people really didn't want to talk about that. And when they're talking, they'll say a little bit about where they grew up and the plantation they were on and how they were treated and that kind of thing. But a lot of times they'll get to the point and they say, well, I don't really like to talk about that because that makes people sad. Well, unfortunately, because it made people sad, people didn't talk about it. And then you lose information. For example, my family didn't know why the name changed because nobody talked about that. But you can find some of these records. You may not find your families, but at least will give you an idea of what it was like for some of the slaves, both going through slavery and after they were emancipated. You can see what some of their lives were like at that point.
Is this like the Federal Writers Project? Is that
Yeah, this is based on that, yes.
Okay, that almost New Deal program.
Yes. So this one, I actually purchased this to hear some of the, and they actually have the recordings of the slaves in their own voices talking about that. And they do have some of it was kind of hard to understand what they were saying, but yeah, that was worth looking at. Here we have Lest We Forget. And this is actually the passage from Africa to slavery and then emancipation. So there are a lot of books that you can look at that tell about the stories. Here we also have 200 years of Black culture in Knoxville. If you are somebody from Knoxville and want to look at that, we've got free Negroes in the District of Columbia from 1790 to 1846. That's another thing I really would love to find out a little bit more about. You hear about slavery, but we don't really hear what were the free people of color doing during those times. And since I have several members of my ancestors who were free people of color, I would love to know what life was like for them. So I'll probably look at some of these things here. We've got the Negro and the American Rebellion, Ray County marriage records of colored people, Black Roots. This is a beginner's guide to tracing the African American family tree. We've got Maryland slave owners and superintendents, how to trace your African American roots, African Americans of Chattanooga, the history of unsung heroes. They even go into, let's see, we've got Rutherford County African American Community, Virginia Register of Free Negroes, Antebellum Diary, African American Community in Knoxville, Black Tennesseans from 1900 to 1939, so you can see what was going on after the Civil War in Tennessee. Black Tennesseans 1790 to 1981. Afro-American genealogy research. So you have some selected lists for resources for genealogy. We've got African Americans in Jackson County, Florida. The African American history of Nashville, slavery in Tennessee, free Blacks and mulattoes in South Carolina. You have an Urban League study of economic and cultural activities of the Negro population of Chattanooga. So if your family is here, you can see what some of that was about. That was from 1947. We have Neither More or Less Than Men, Slavery in Georgia, Documentary History. That's a DVD, I believe that one is. And then we have the 1960 sit-ins in Chattanooga, if you want to see what was going on here at that point. So we have a lot of information from the public library that you can take a look at to help you get started or to point you to other sources for genealogy. So that's pretty much what I have. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to talk about pretty much anything. If there was something that you wanted to go back to in my family or something like that, or questions that you have about genealogy itself, I'd be willing to entertain questions. Yes.
I got one about the classification of mulatto.
Yes.
A lot of those records, in a kind country of Jim Crow, where even one drop of black blood makes you all black in terms of, in
Yes.
the eyes of the law. It's just, I'm curious about what that designation mulatto actually did for a citizen to have, you know what I mean? If it made a difference
It didn't really make a difference in how they were treated.
Yeah.
Because as you said, one drop of black blood meant you were black.
Okay.
Now, I thought it was pretty interesting, and I'll go back several of these. I thought it was pretty interesting that for my grandfather, here in the 1920 census, he was listed as mulatto, which technically both of his parents were black. Now, his father was mulatto. And in some cases, I think because of the person's complexion, they looked at the person, they said, oh, you must be mixed, they listed him as mulatto.
Okay. Do you have any idea how long that term mulatto was actually used on a census? Like the 1930 census, was it still being used?
If we look at the 1930 census well, actually, I find it kind of interesting here that for my great grandfather, who was mulatto, he was listed as black. But
so this really is a matter of
who's taking the record. And also some of those census records weren't actually taken from the actual residents. Sometimes they were taken from neighbors.
Yeah.
So not only did you have the enumerator who wrote down what they wanted, you may also be getting information, secondhand information.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we look at the 1930 census, for my mother's side of the family, they listed them as black.
Okay.
Now, my mom's side, they weren't mulatto at all, but I don't know. Or actually, they list in the 1920 census, they're listed as black. In the 1930 census, they're listed as Negro. In the 1940 census, they're listed as Negro. So based on what year the census was, and you can take a look at, they have a record for every census, what information was gathered and how they classified the information. But pretty much for every census year, you get that kind of thing. The other thing is, I think it's the 1870 census where they started putting the relationship to the head of the household. Prior to that, they just listed the people. And you had to guess, is this a child? Is this a boarder? Is this a, and on some of the records, they will, in addition to having the head, daughter, son, they'll also have if they were a servant or if they were a boarder or what was going on with that. So it does give you more information about who was in the household and that kind of deal. Any other questions? Any questions online in the chat? Okay.
I got another, Gail. Is
Yes.
The Ancestry.com membership, is it an annual membership? How do you know how often you pay?
I believe you can do quarterly. But I mean, if you want to do a year, you can, but they do have it broken down, I think, by quarter. Yes.
Do you know if those kinds of websites are helpful if a lot of your documents or your family's documents are in different countries?
There are some other countries that do have census records, but if your family immigrated here, you can find out, when they immigrated, you can get records from whatever point they entered. Some of them have like passenger lists and that kind of thing. You can look at that. For, like I said, the 1920 census, they did have, if they had come here and they became naturalized citizens, or they have that information, what year they became naturalized. Some of the other countries do have census records as well. So you can go back to. Actually, Ancestry.com does have some of those records as well. Any other questions?
One last question. So
you can ask as many questions as you want. Yeah.
This is awesome. I'm from Salt Lake City, and I'm embarrassed to say I never actually went into the genealogy.
See, now you need to go take a trip back and take a look.
Right.
But actually, you don't really even have to do that because a lot of stuff is online now. The Mormon Church here does a lot of things. That was another source that I was trying to get to. They have some people in the Mormon Church here that do genealogy, and they can help you with getting started and that kind of thing. But there's also the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau has a lot of records on people who were slaves, and they pretty much help people get settled into their new lives after slavery. I have not explored the Freedmen's Bureau records very much. I haven't been able to find anything with a quick search on anything in my family. I was better off in the census records on that. But I am going to be exploring that a little bit more and trying to get back as far as I can. Now that if I can actually hook into my distant cousin, I can now get that back to 1650, but I just have to find out where my family branches off from them. The other thing that was pretty interesting was when I linked back to the Wooten family, and I could say, okay, this is where the Wootens came in and that kind of stuff. Through 23andMe, I actually found some distant cousins who were Wootens. And let me get to that record actually. Oops, is it there? Yeah, where we have some of the Wootens here. We've got John and James and Will listed as stepsons. So I found some family of mine through 23andMe, and their name was Wooten, and they actually live in Statesboro, Georgia. And I actually went to a Wooten family reunion because I knew where, once I talked to them and that kind of stuff, they were actually descendants of John and James. And it was really amazing to me when I walked into the reunion and I saw a guy who looked just like my cousin John. And just to be able to connect and say, hey, this is where I come off from your family. Your ancestors were John and James, and my great grandmother was Anna. So she was their older sister. I've also found someone who, from the Blunt relationship between David and Mariah and the Blunts, she's actually a descendant, not of Andrew Blunt, but of his younger sister, Jessie Blunt. So it's really neat to be able to match through DNA and find distant relatives and be able to find other information like that. Another interesting story from 23andMe. When I first signed up with 23andMe, I was matched with a distant cousin. I think she was a fourth cousin. And she sent me an email. She was trying to find out any information about her family. And her story basically was she was born in 1972 in Vietnam. And she was trying to find anyone who was related to her. It listed me as her fourth cousin. And her question to me was, did you have any relatives who fought in Vietnam? And I just had to laugh and said, my mom was the 15th of 16 kids. My dad, the 7th of 8. I had a lot of cousins who were in Vietnam. But my first cousins would have been too closely related to her. And she was basically trying to, what happened with her? She was born in 1972 in Vietnam. She was immediately put up for adoption. And in the orphanage, they realized how poorly the half-Black children were being treated. So one of the nuns was able to get her out of the orphanage and over to England, where she was adopted. When she found relatives, she tried to, connect to some of the relatives. The Vietnamese relatives, as soon as they found out she was half-Black, a lot of them didn't want to talk to her. I was able to help her, and she also had some professional genealogy detectives, pretty much, who went through, and she eventually found her father in North Carolina and was able to come over and visit him. So it was pretty good. And happy ending to that. Not only did she find her father, but she also found out that her mother and her father were in love, and her father was sent out of the country before she was born. He lost track of the mother. And yeah, that was the situation. Because to me, I was thinking that might be a nightmare situation. If you don't know the relationship between your parents, and under those circumstances, it could have been a lot of really bad things. But they were actually in love. She was wanted, but when he had to leave the country, her mother, I guess, couldn't take care of her by herself and put her up for adoption.
Gail, we have a question from the online audience. If there's any difference in how records are taken in the States versus American territories?
That, unfortunately, I don't know. I haven't looked at the records in the American territories. This is my personal journey. Unfortunately, I'm not a professional genealogist. So I only know from my experience, so I unfortunately can't help you with that. But I'm sure if you go to the library or contact the Mormon library, they can probably help you with that. Any other questions?
Was there a point where there was a really high moment of something you found out and a low moment of part of your search?
There were a lot of high moments. I can tell you when I saw the records, the enlistment records, and was actually able to touch the enlistment records for Presley Dawson, I got chills. I mean, it was almost tears in my eyes kind of things that number one, my family existed. And then being able to actually touch the very same thing that he put his mark on. That was amazing. Finding the cause of my grandmother's death, that was it's like, wow, here it is right there,
Can I ask, what was the cause of it?
It was malaria.
Oh, that was, okay, yeah,
Yes,
that's right. Okay,
yes.
sorry.
Let's see, what was another one that was a highlight? Seeing the memorial for the U.S. colored troops, actually being there for the ceremony, being recognized as a descendant of one of the soldiers and that kind of thing, that was a highlight in my life. Just seeing that my aunt was a welder in 1945 was like, wow, go you, yeah, I mean, we hear Rosie the Riveter and, we have Opal the welder. Each time that I was able to go back another generation and see some more things, there's actually, and I don't have it on here, but for Mariah Wooten, I saw some records. Is actually her wedding records, her marriage certificates, or it was actually just kind of a notation of her marriage to David Blunt. One of the things, and it's just like a little log, it says David Blunt, Mariah Wooten, and over on the side, it says her father was Aram Starkey. So it's like, wow, now I know who her father is. Don't quite know who her mother was yet, but being able to go back just another generation of names that I didn't know and being able to link to that. Every time I find something new, it's a highlight for me. I have some leaves now I need to investigate. If I use ancestry.com. I have used Family Search, very limited. I have done 23andMe as far as the DNA testing, as well as the Ancestry DNA testing. Being able to link to cousins and being able to talk to some of them and find out, well, tell me about your family, and seeing where we match up and where we link. Talking to the distant cousin who is related to Edward Dorsey, that's a highlight for me. And I'm really looking forward to, excuse me, being able to talk to him more and pick his brain. He does a lot of the stuff with the DNA. And he's working on a project where they're looking at the descendants of the founding fathers of Maryland and that kind of thing. And he's pretty excited talking to me too. He says, hey, there's a strand of your DNA and your father's DNA that exactly matches my father, my uncle, and my sister. And that's exciting for me to hear something like that and to be able to get back just a little bit further. I don't know a whole lot about DNA, but he's an expert on it. So I'm looking forward to finding some time to really talk to him about that.
When did the Dawson family make the move from Maryland to Philadelphia? Right?
I grew up in Philadelphia, yes. When my dad was about 16 years old, my grandmother decided to sell the farm because it was too much work for her, being a widow and her children were growing up and that kind of thing. So she sold the farm, and my father was actually left there to make sure everything, at 16, was left there to make sure that everything went well with the sale of the farm. And he was given a choice. His mother said, you have to finish high school, but you have a choice whether you want to finish high school in Philadelphia or you want to finish high school in Maryland. Now, my dad made the choice to finish high school in Maryland. And the reason for it was this. For Black students in Maryland, you only had to go through 11 grades of school. And in Philadelphia, you had to go through 12. So my dad figured, I'll finish school in Maryland. And he stayed with a family friend by the name of Annie Williams, which was that was a pretty significant thing for me too, because in some of the deposition paperwork, I grew up knowing Annie Williams as Aunt Mitt. She was not my aunt, but she was a family friend, a close family friend, and she's actually who my father stayed with while he finished up high school in Maryland. Going through the deposition paperwork, I find out that my great-grandfather, Presley Dawson, was sent, they say, by the Freedmen's Bureau in the deposition. He was sent by the Freedmen's Bureau to the Eastern Shore of Maryland with Armistead Williams. And when I read that to my dad was like, who? I said, Armistead Williams. He's like, really? And I said, well, who's Armistead Williams? Armistead Williams is Aunt Mitt's father. So that explains a lot to me, because growing up, we used to go down to Eastern Shore, Maryland and visit people there a lot. Aunt Mitt, before she was moved to a nursing home in Philadelphia, and then we would visit her every Sunday. But a lot of people in the Eastern Shore, Maryland always called my dad Tommy Dorsey. And I always, when I was a little kid, I thought I was really confused. I'm like, why are they calling him Dorsey? His name is Dawson. Well, Aunt Mitt, until the day she died, and she died, I think, at 105 or something like that. But till the day she died, she called my father Tommy Dorsey. And the reason was she knew my great grandfather, Presley Dorsey. So she knew the name was Dorsey. And she never made that change just because the government said it had to be Dawson now. But finding some of those, right, finding the deposition paperwork, that was amazing to me. Presley was a free person of color, at least according to the depositions. I haven't been able to find him before 1870. So I would love to be able to find him before 1870, along with some of the other free people of color. So there have been a lot of highlights for me. The lowlights. Oops, not that one. Seeing that record. And that one, I've just found that just days ago. Because I knew I had seen slave records before, but it didn't really hit me. Hey, you should look up the slave records to see if you could find your great grandmother. Because that's the only person that I know who her owners were. Now, a lot of my mom's side of the family, I know that a lot of her ancestors were slaves, but we have no idea who their owners were.
It's amazing to look at the difference between an 1860 census and an 1870, when all of a sudden a former slave is an actual human being.
Yes.
Not for just 3/5 for the purpose of
Yes.
population representation count, but yeah.
But I mean, the other thing for me is seeing with this record, where in 1840, they didn't bother to list the people who were in the household. They listed the head of the household, and then they listed how many people of which categories were in the household. They didn't have names either. So if you didn't know the head of the household, you would never find your family back there. But that's why looking at things like death certificates, wills, if you can find them, that will help you get back a little bit further. Even in some of the, some people have been able to find emancipation papers where, for example, it may be the owner died and in his will, he may have freed the slaves or that kind of thing. Some people have been able to find those kind of records. I've not been able to find anything like that. So I don't know for my ancestors who appear in the 1840 and 1850 and 1860 census of free people of color. I have no idea why they were free or what they did for a living, really, or any of that information. I would love to find that information out. Yes.
So you said you started this in 1993.
Yes.
So how long, I guess, in total has it taken you? Has it been like somewhat consistent? Have you taken breaks? Like
I've taken a lot of breaks because I have a job that I have to keep. And yeah, and some of it I have intentionally put things on hold because it's like, okay, I've got to get this done. I don't have time to get sucked into, genealogy stuff. I haven't really talked to the distant cousin that's related to the Dorseys very much because right now I can't afford time-wise to get sucked into that. So I'm hoping for, another little break or something like that where I can dig into that. So there've been a lot of really long breaks. And then I'll get maybe an email on Ancestry that, somebody asks a question or somebody answers a question that I ask, because I've put some things on some of the bulletin boards out there. That's another thing on like ancestry.com. They do have some bulletin boards for different areas and you can, post things. Like I posted a message on one of the bulletin boards that said, hey, I'm looking for free Dorseys in either Howard County or Caroline County, Maryland. And I've gotten some people who have responded. Sometimes I'm busy and I don't get a chance to look at the bulletin boards and I don't realize somebody sent a message. So there have been really huge breaks in that. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Are you related to any Dorseys in Chattanooga? It's actually a gentleman that's my boss here. His last name is Dorsey.
Not that I know of, but I would love to talk to him and find out what he knows about his family to see if maybe there is a relationship there. I don't know. But I claim all Dorseys. I do. In fact, a few years ago, I bought a car down at one of the dealerships here, and the salesperson's name was Dorsey, and I was like, "Hey, cousin," despite the fact that he was a white Dorsey. Hey, cousin. But there was a guy in my middle school who was a janitor. His name was Dorsey. We're like, he must be related somehow. So I will claim everybody. We'll figure out the actual family relationships later. There's actually a guy here, he used to be here, Joshua McFadder. I was trying to find information about his family too, because the Wooten reunion that I went to, it was a Wooten McFadder reunion. And I tried to talk to him, he said he didn't know a lot about his family, but it's like, you're probably related somehow to at least that part of the family. So, but yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I guess we end a little bit early then. Thank you.